So hello and welcome. My name's Steve Nobel, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Christina Samycia on the journey of discovering inner peace. Now, Christina holds a doctorate in clinical psychology, a master's degree in kinesiology, and her mission is to inspire and challenge individuals to discover their authentic selves and lead a more authentic life. And the book we're talking on summarizes her approach to therapy, which she's been redefining for 15 years. The book combines psychological theory, spirituality, quantum mechanics, trauma research, Eastern philosophical thought, and various exercises and information. And there is a link to a website going out with this podcast. So, hi, Christina.
Hello, Steve.
Nice chatting with you. And congratulations on getting the book out.
Thank you.
So I've pulled out some bits from the book, basically. And but before I dive into that, can I just ask you what got you into this whole area in the first place? The whole area of therapy and spirituality and quantum mechanics and all of these bits. Why have you? What drove you to dive into all these parts?
Oh my goodness, that's a
big question. Yeah.
That is a big question. Well, I think therapy sort of found me. I mean, I've always been interested in psychotherapy, psychology, Eastern philosophical thought, as well as spirituality. And then as I started my doctorate, I started just incorporating different spiritual concepts. And I really, in the last few years, was very excited about and interested in cellular memory. So a lot of my book kind of talks about how to process trauma from cellular memory. And then in my personal journey, you know, working on my personal growth, having experiences with things like past life trauma. So that really kind of sparked the journey.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, let me dive in. This is in your book, you say our childhood experiences shape our beliefs about ourselves and the world. Our childhood experiences create a highly inaccurate foundation of how we view ourselves and the world. And the question is, do these experiences eternally, as in this lifetime, define us, or do they have to define us?
Definitely not. And that's what I address in my book. I kind of first start off the book explaining like why we think and feel the way we do, and then give some alternative concepts. So for example, the concept that I am not lovable, that's a very, you know, prevalent concept. So just because you may have created that in childhood doesn't mean that it's not true. And then I kind of offer suggestions on, you know, new belief systems, as well as different techniques to detach from these old belief systems. And we can become whoever we want to become.
Yeah, that's great. It's liberating, isn't it? I remember some spiritual teachers saying years ago, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, which I thought was curious at the time when I heard that. I think later in the book, I pulled out something that says, you are lovable and good enough exactly the way you are. No one can love you unconditionally except yourself. Isn't this the issue that, you know, we don't love ourselves and so we're not allowing it in really? Or we just kind of say, you know, you're making it up. We always kind of discount when people are genuinely loving us or giving us, you know, appreciation, we'll discount it.
Right. We sometimes just don't even see it based on our belief systems. And that's why it's very important to energetically detach from these belief systems. Because I do talk in the book about, you know, the concept of law of attraction. So if we believe that we're not lovable, we're going to attract that. And also we're not going to be able to see the situations where we are. Yeah.
So this idea of we're going to attract it, this is something what it crosses over, I think, in the coaching world, spiritual world, say, you know, the law of attraction or the law of resonance. Do you dive into that in your book? How is it that our belief systems will actually attract these kind of things? These are self-fulfilling prophecies, I guess you would say they would be.
Exactly. And it also, like, these experiences shape our view. So if the way I sort of explain it is, you know, in childhood, we create, let's say, red colored glasses, right? And so we're always walking around with a certain lens. And one of the benefits of, you know, therapy and self-exploration is to kind of take off those glasses so you have a different perspective.
Yeah. No, I dived in because I think for me anyway, it seems like we dive into therapy because, you know, we have no choice. We reach a point of desperation, whatever it is, and we're going to go into therapy. I think I went in my early 30s and I've been probably, I did about 13 years, I think, of it. Do you think that if people go in young, like nowadays, you know, people might go in quite younger, that it kind of catches it earlier, or does it really not matter, that the idea that if you go in your 30s, 40s, 50s, it gets harder, or does it not make any difference, do you think?
Well, I think it's great. I have a lot of clients that are a lot younger, and I sort of wish, gosh, I wish I started when I was in my 20s. It would have made life a lot
easier.
But it doesn't, I mean, and then I have clients that start therapy in their 60s and 70s. So I guess it's never too late, but better to start off younger. And I think this younger generation is very open, and they're open to the different types of therapy. So I'm not, of course, a traditional talk therapist, because I feel like talk therapy only gets you about, you know, 80% of the way. And sometimes even I find that talk therapy can re-traumatize you. If you're constantly talking about the same story, you know, that's not helpful. So what I've incorporated in psychotherapy is different techniques, so that as to detach from these traumas energetically. So that's kind of how I'm different and how my book is different.
Fabulous. I mean, the statement that you are lovable and good enough exactly the way you are, it reminded me very much of the Bridget Jones film. I don't know if you've seen that film.
Oh, yeah.
When someone says it to her, I think a potential lover, and her and her friends are totally shocked. And they're kind of sitting around the dinner table processing, what you mean? You're not too fat, you're not too thin. All of these kind of self-critical thoughts that we have. And we're kind of trained in it, aren't we? I believe that we're trained to be self-critical in school and everywhere, completely, constantly evaluating ourselves, judging ourselves, contrast and compare and contrast, all of this stuff. Do you think this is something we have to unlearn as we become less judgmental towards ourselves?
Oh, of course. This is a lot of the programming that we've sort of received. And also, in order to change anything, as I talk about in my book, you first need to accept it. Because and I'm a big fan of Louise Hay. So I reference her in the book a lot, in terms of, you know, and her, one of her, you know, biggest ideas is that we should never, ever, ever criticize ourselves. Every time we criticize ourselves, every time we judge ourselves, that creates trauma in the body. And so it's important to, you know, embrace loving ourselves, which is really hard to do. It's a lifetime practice.
Do you think that there's, I imagine there's a lot of people that don't realize the degree that they're actually criticizing themselves, or this self-talk that runs all the time?
Yes.
It's almost like unconscious that you know, someone might reach for the fridge and the voice might start saying you're gonna fat, but you don't even hear it, and it creates a kind of depression. Do you know what I mean? It seems to me that the more conscious we are of these voices, the more we can deal with them.
Exactly. And that's sort of what my book explains is, and what I do in my therapy sessions is I help bring the subconscious to the conscious awareness.
Where it can be changed, right?
Exactly.
Now, I think I read in your book somewhere you talk about radical self-acceptance. You mentioned acceptance a minute ago, and that's a great term, isn't it? Radical self-acceptance. What is radical self-acceptance?
It's just accepting yourself exactly the way you are, accepting your circumstance. And this is a situation, this is a idea that I even struggle with, and I have to sometimes reread my own chapter when when we get triggered, when we're not liking, you know, the situation we're in, what we're feeling, and I go, oh no, I need to practice radical acceptance right now.
Right. Yeah, it's a good thing to stop and have a breath and remind ourselves, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, one of the things which I read in your book, you said our subconscious mind creates mechanisms to protect us from emotional pain. Our brain has an inherent mechanism to distort reality, to psychologically protect us from harm so that we can survive in our environment. Where our unconscious mind psychologically kind of distorts reality, do you mean for some people they're actually living in a fantasy world? They can't see the real world. They're filtering out stuff all the time. What would you mean by that it kind of distorts reality?
Well, we create these defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
So for example, let's go back to like childhood experiences when, you know, people repress memories, or when they sort of minimize, you know, the sort of, let's say, the emotional abuse or physical abuse. Yeah, so we all have these defense mechanisms. And I think it's very important to understand them, because in order to really get to those subconscious programs, it's so important to do that.
And if it is an actual protection mechanism, which I totally accept, how can we kind of disarm our defense mechanisms without, you know, like pulling down the walls type of thing? How do we kind of heal without pulling everything down, going, I know you got this a protection mechanism, but I'm just going to pull it down and get rid of it. You know, I mean, they're there for a reason. And is there a kind of process of pacing someone through so that they feel safe, that the walls can kind of come down and they can kind of go to the truth of themselves?
Of course, that's why it's so good to be working with somebody, so that it is a very sort of gentle process, and also when the client will be ready when that happens.
Yeah. I think you gave a good example in the book around belief systems. You said, for example, if our parents were conflicted about our birth, we might form a belief that we're not wanted. Now, this is going to be very early on, isn't it? We may not even be aware of it. And
exactly,
how do we find these kind of belief systems which we're totally unconscious of, but driving our lives?
Well, and that's where like coaching comes in, and psychotherapy, because you know, when I first meet with a client, for example, you know, I say, well, tell me some of your story. And then I start to see little themes that they may have never, you know, seen before. And then you kind of piece those things together with how they feel, how they think, the situations they find themselves in. So for example, if they didn't feel wanted in childhood, there's going to be this theme of like, well, I just don't feel like I fit in, you know, with my friend, you know, so forth and so on. And then you kind of make this connection of, well, this is what happened in childhood. So are you really seeing things clearly, or are you projecting? Or are you just finding yourself in the same situation over and over and over again? And the reason you are is because you really need to clear this trauma.
Yeah. So there's a trail of clues, I suppose, that point back to the original.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why in my book, in one of the chapters, I have the reader sort of write out their sort of life history. Because when you actually look at it, you know, in total, it's like, oh, okay. And then I have, you know, prompting questions that may get to those points.
Now, I think you mentioned, or certainly in the book, that pain is stored in the cells, cellular memory. So how easy is it to get to the kind of core of the computer, so to speak, the core system, and actually reprogram or release that energy? Does this involve something more than talk therapy? You said you involve something like body work or movement, or
Correct.
What about that? Yeah.
Well, that's a great question, because the technique that I use is called neural emotional technique, and I incorporate that into the book. I mean, there's other different techniques, but that's sort of my go-to. I also do sort of hypnotherapy, but with neural emotional technique, we process the trauma through the meridian points in the body. So for example, if somebody's struggling with sadness, it's a lung issue. So we're clearing it through the lung meridian. And what I found is that with some clients, it's like, oh, one time it's gone, but then sometimes it takes, you know, several sessions, because also it's kind of peeling the layer of that onion, right? You know, you're working on it. And what I've noticed is that if there's a specific belief system, trauma, emotional pain, it's going to get less and less. Sometimes it goes away in first try, but it doesn't, because we have to remember, not only are we dealing with our own trauma, but we have ancestral trauma, so our parents, grandparents, and then we also have past life trauma. So we have to work on all of these different threads.
Yeah. How accepted is it in the mainstream, like the world you're in, that we hold ancestral and other lifetime trauma? Or is it you're kind of being a bit radical and stepping away from the, you know, the kind of psychological work environment you're in? How much is that accepted? Or are you a bit of a heretic?
It's a little bit radical, but what I'm noticing is, I mean, there's so much more talk on cellular memory trauma. So it's becoming much more mainstream.
They're catching up. Oh, that's
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Well, going on with the Louise Hay thing. So Louise Hay was quite a pioneer in your body speaks your mind type of thing, you know.
Yes.
Now, you say in your book, unprocessed emotional pain will likely surface and can manifest as emotional and or physical ailments. So really, what you're saying is healing really has to happen at a different level before we start thinking about popping pills or cutting parts of our body out, because that's what mainstream medicine is.
Oh,
Really.
yeah, yes.
Problem. You know, I mean, they've embraced a little bit. My local GP actually, surgery does embrace acupuncture and osteo and
Sure.
these kind of things, but mostly in the UK anyway, no, it's you know, it's pills or surgery. So, but really, you're trying to address it really at the core, aren't you, before it gets that far?
Exactly, exactly. So I discuss in my book how if we had repeated trauma, let's say anxiety or fear, that's in the kidney meridian. So if we're constantly feeling anxiety, that is going to definitely create some issues with the kidneys. And then eventually it's going to manifest as a physical ailment. So it's so important to do the work on the subconscious and the trauma if there is a physical pain.
Yeah. Oh, I'm a big believer in it. I very rarely go to GPs for anything these days.
Oh, yes.
I'm having acupuncture and reflexology and ozone therapy. I just do the whole works, you know, because as we get older, we have to look after ourselves. And a lot. I've been doing 30 years of processing, you know, so I'm fully on the journey with you. One big thing that I read in the book, and I think it's a major thing for a lot of people, another major paradigm shift to remember is you're always safe. Fears are not real. They exist in the mind. Fear is about some future incident that may or may not happen. Now, of course, there's a distinction, isn't there, that if you're in a main road and the car is hurtling towards you, the body will go, get out. Or if someone's got a knife and you see them there, your body might go, get out here. But most of the fears that we deal with in the Western world is our mind just playing, thinking about stuff.
Yeah,
so,
danger is real, but fear is not.
Yeah. It's I mean, it's a major problem in the Western world. We're constantly looking at Netflix and horror movies and all, thinking of the worst case scenario, reading the news, of course, if we still read the news.
Yes.
What do we do about this core belief about, because it must come from childhood, doesn't it? Early on, am I safe in the world? It's a core thing for a lot of people, I think.
Definitely. And it also comes from past lives.
Yeah.
We've all died several times and probably in some horrific ways.
Horrible ways.
So we carry a lot of these memories subconsciously.
So is this something also you address these other ways? So hypnotherapy, neural emotional technique, and these other things can start addressing that.
Exactly.
And do you find clients then go, well, actually, I feel different in the world. I actually feel I can move safely in the world. I don't feel the same anxiety anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what happens. What I've noticed is that, you know, people have certain triggers and they'll notice like, oh my gosh, I spoke to my mom the other day and she didn't trigger me. She always triggers me. It's like, yeah, this is working. Yay.
Yeah, it's always down to the mum or the mother-in-law.
Right. Unfortunately, for moms.
I read also in your book, start practicing life affirming, not fear-based living. You know, exactly. and the further on we get in the book, the more kind of affirming, the more positive, the more love. It's the more it takes you on this journey of expanding your thinking. How can someone start thinking about life affirming living? What would you say is an example of life affirming living?
Well, looking at the ways that you are living in fear. So, for example, if you're working at a job that you hate because you're afraid of making a change, or in a relationship that you're afraid to, you know, so it's looking at all those fears and just saying, okay, like this is not living. This is just kind of surviving.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess a lot of people are in that space, really. Yeah. Finally, I just want to ask you about the spiritual dimension, because your book addresses the spiritual dimension. You say, by reconnecting to our spiritual selves and understanding why we are here, this can aid in alleviating our emotional distress. Can you say something about the spiritual aspect of your book?
Well, we are, spiritual beings having a human experience. And sometimes in our modern world, that's really not valued. And I think that's why a lot of people are suffering, is they're here to learn kind of their purpose in life and, why they're here, what we have to accomplish. And if those things aren't being addressed, that really can create a lot of distress.
Yeah. And I guess if you're leading a spiritual life, that you would start embracing the idea that this body is not the end of.
Exactly. And therefore it's nothing to fear, even death.
Yeah.
And very important sort of existential concept to really embrace, is being okay, like, okay, this is all temporary.
Yeah. I'm getting a bit older, and it's kind of reassuring that I've had 30 odd years of practice behind me. So when I get to the doorway of death, I'll kind of go, hey, it's just, another part of the journey. I'm not saying I won't be a bit scared. I might be like, eek, but I'm sure that I'll be better prepared for it than someone who has no thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine who was semi-spiritual, I would say more religious than spiritual, he actually approached death in a peaceful way. And I asked him about it, and he said, I've lived a full life. And I thought, that's a really interesting dimension to take. I've lived a full life, which is what you might be saying, life affirming. He followed his dreams. He did what he wanted to do. He has no regrets. He loved his family. They loved him. And he died really peacefully. And I gave him a hug, and he said, I won't see you again. And I was like, oh, I didn't really believe him at the time, but then he was gone 2 days later. So it's kind of nice that if we can embrace our spiritual selves and live a full life affirming life, actually we can find peace in this world and hopefully beyond.
Exactly.
So Christina, is there anything else you want to give listeners about your book and your work? Any final piece you'd like to say about it?
Well, I guess my book is really good for anybody who's starting their journey, or even somebody who's further along their journey, because even like myself, I have to reread chapters of my book, because we all need reminders, especially, right now we're being triggered sort of left and right, and because we're really working on, releasing a lot of stuff. So this is a really good book to just have as a reminder. And I think it's also a great book for practitioners who, because that sort of was my, motivation to write the book, is I always have clients who say, what is a good book that I could read? And I'm like, well, I like parts of this book and parts of this book. So I pretty much wrote a book that's sort of the cliff notes of everything that I do in my practice and everything that I've done, in my personal practice. So it's really a good sort of cliff notes sort of version of psychology, spirituality, metaphysics. And then I do reference a lot of other books. If somebody wanted to read more about, let's say, past lives, I, have a few resources, or more about Louise Hay and her affirmations and things like that.
So the journey of discovering inner peace, I think you can get it on your website, and you can get it on Amazon.
Yes. Yeah, it's available on my website, and I'm offering free shipping right now. But you could also get it on Amazon.
Perfect. Well, I'll send a link out with this podcast so people can check you out and find your book.
Great. Thank you so much.
It was lovely chatting, Christina. Have a great day.
Same here. You
over
too.
there
Nice
across the
meeting
pond.
you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.